Hi, and welcome back from a little winter break to a brand new episode of Plan C, Ocean Interventions to Address Climate Change. I'm your host, Anna Madlener, MRV Manager at the Carbon to Sea initiative. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Will Burns, who is the Co-Executive Director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. Good afternoon, or good morning in your case, Will.
No, it is afternoon.
All right, it's night here, so yeah, good evening. All right, today's episode is personally a very exciting one. We are joined by Tanis Torlaksson and Brad Rocklin from Cascade Climate. Cascade Climate is driving forward natural climate interventions by connecting industry, government, and science, most recently through the first Foundations document for enhanced rock weathering, or ERW, which is an open system carbon removal method that speeds up rock weathering to pull CO2 from the air. As part of the Foundations process, Cascade built a new data sharing system to foster cross-sector learning. That's also the reason why we're joined by Jackie Long, who is the co-founder of Submarine Scientific, a small ocean science and modeling company. Submarine Scientific, Carbon to Sea, and NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, are partnering together to lead a data initiative for field research on ocean alkalinity enhancement.
Okay, Anna, let's be real here. Data protocols don't exactly scream riveting for most of our folks. So what's in it for our listeners today?
Yeah, definitely fair point, but fear not. It's going to be an exciting one. The OAE, so the Ocean Alkalinity Enhancement Data Protocol that Jackie is working on, is currently open for review until March 7th. And we wanted to highlight its role in shaping the future of carbon removal by coupling it with the learnings and use case scenarios from Cascade. OAE and ERW are sort of carbon removal cousins, if you will, and it's really essential, I think, in this episode to understand that strong data sharing frameworks today could pave the way for transparent monitoring, reporting, and verification of carbon credits in the private sector in the future.
Okay, you sold me. Let's bring in our guest.
All right, let's go. Hi, everyone. How's it going?
Good. Hi, Anna. Good.
Hi. So many voices. Amazing. Let's start with a round of introductions and context setting. So if all three of you would please introduce yourselves, say who you are so we know which voice belongs to whom, and then a bit about your respective organization. So perhaps, Jackie, let's start with you.
Sounds good. Hi, Anna. Hi, Will. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here. I'm Jackie Long, an ocean scientist and co-founder of Submarine Scientific. We develop tools and technologies to support safe and effective scaling of MCDR. So we're working on ocean modeling software and custom solutions, carbon credit verification, technical oceanographic consulting, and system-wide strategy development, which includes projects like the data standards development and more community-driven work, which is what we're going to be diving into today.
Great. And for those maybe a slightly tiny bit new to the field, MCDR stands for Marine Carbon Dioxide Removal. So if you hear someone say MCDR, that's it. Brad, why don't you go next?
Yeah, hey, Anna. Well, thanks for having me and super happy to be here. So my name is Brad Rocklin. I'm a program manager at Cascade Climate, which is a philanthropic-backed nonprofit working on carbon removal, but a range of open system climate interventions. Cascade is best known for enhanced rock weathering and our work there, but we are sort of exploring and working across a range of CDR pathways. And prior to joining Cascade, I've spent actually most of my career, most of the last decade, at project developers trying to do first of their kind projects in nature-based solutions and carbon removal. So spent a couple years with a group called Indigo Agriculture, who is one of the first groups working on soil organic carbon and regenerative agricultural practices. At a point when the net zero movement was really taking off and I spent a lot of time there thinking about go-to-market strategy and the various ways that you could start to scale some of these early climate interventions in the agricultural space. And then a couple years with a group called Running Tide, which was one of the first ocean-based carbon removal companies. So similarly thinking about what it looked like to try to bring the first projects into the world in the ocean sector. So at Cascade, I get to work pretty cross-functionally and across a range of pathways, thinking about, in particular, what the different paths to scale and maturity look like in different parts of the carbon removal sector.
Fantastic. So Tanis, let's hear from you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Tanis Thorlickson, Program Director also at Cascade Climate with Brad. And I lead our data work, our data query work in the enhanced rock weathering space. So really excited to talk about data. And Jackie and I have shared notes on all of the challenges of getting data right in these early fields. So really happy to be here.
Wonderful. All right. So to start out with, let's start talking data. Jackie, I'd love to hear from you a bit more about your work on the data initiative for ocean alkalinity enhancement field research that you're leading together with folks from NOAA, and that obviously Carbon to Sea flag is supporting and funding. Why don't you start there?
Sure. So the goal of this project is to standardize the data coming out of ocean alkalinity enhancement field trials, or OAE. These field trials are ongoing and they're ramping up, and looking into the safety and efficacy of ocean alkalinity enhancement, OAE, by conducting small pilot projects of this intervention method. So we're already starting to see data come out of some of these projects and move into the verifiers in the carbon market space. And I think over a year ago, maybe almost 2 years ago or longer now, Carbon to Sea started thinking about the potentially foreboding future of MCDR, where there wasn't a guideline for how to standardize data. And that would make it really difficult to compare across studies. And it's also important to note that assessing the quality of data, which is ultimately what we're basing the carbon credits on, is really dependent on having associated information about that data that isn't necessarily required anywhere right now. So not just the numbers itself, but additional information. So things like what equations or coefficients were used to estimate derived variables or values, if those are provided, how measurements were quality controlled, or just ensuring that we're calling the same variable the same name across studies, because I can't tell you how many times I've had to write into code to change variable names or convert units to be consistent. So small standardizations like these snowball into bigger mechanisms of efficiency when you think about how many people need to use these data and cross-compare them. So you, me, Anna, and Irene started some of these initial conversations way back then about ramping up this project to avoid some of those pitfalls in the space that might spring up without this, and also ensure that there's trust and transparency in the market moving forward. And like you said, this is a team effort. So led by Carbon to Sea, our company, Submarine Scientific, and NOAA, but a much larger growing community effort involving over 50 researchers from academia, the private sector, federal organizations, NGOs, all the sectors. That's been really fun to work with. And then just one other side note, we've been talking about OAE, ocean alkalinity enhancement. That's what this protocol is focused on, but it's very applicable to any MCDR, marine carbon dioxide removal intervention space, because the measurements you're taking in other intervention pathways have a ton of overlap. So we're hoping that this can be a useful protocol to a broader audience, and maybe even adopted into further MCDR protocols with some minor tweaking and additions.
Fantastic. Thank you for that wonderful overview and scene setting. Between us, I think we've all talked about this quite a bit broadly for our audience. I think it would be very useful to share, Brad, how on a big picture, Cascade Climate's work overlaps to an extent with ocean alkalinity enhancement, perhaps also introduce enhanced rock weathering. We haven't talked about that pathway on our podcast yet. And broadly why data standards are relevant or are a relevant component of CDR research, and how you leveraged that sort of initial milestone that Jackie is currently working on for OAE for enhanced rock weathering. And hear a bit more about your assessment on how the two overlap and how we should think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Anna. And I think, Cascade as an organization, we're close to 2 years old, a little over a year and a half old at this point. And I think as we were founded as an organization, Tanis and I actually joined as part of the second wave of the organization. But the initial founders were really focused on enhanced rock weathering and this sort of idea of standardization. And as you were seeing this bottoms up project development, there was not a huge barrier to entry necessarily for projects getting going in the field setting. So you were seeing a lot of different approaches to measurement, you were seeing a lot of different ways that these projects were to get research going, and just learnings out in the field. So there was sort of this strong wave of momentum that Cascade was able to come in and play a little bit of a moderator role for the field, I think, being able to bring in academia and project developers and government actors, and just to be able to get the whole field going in a specific direction, figuring out where there were differences in opinion, what was operationally feasible versus what would be, the ideal state in an academic context, and just where the practicalities were of trying to get this early field off the ground in its earliest stages. That's led to a number of outputs, which Tanis will talk about in detail related to the data aspect, but also something called Foundations for Quantification, which was sort of developed by that whole group of stakeholders, 50 plus academic scientists, 20 plus project developers, credit issuers, and buyers, a number of nonprofits. That is sort of a distillation of the best available science and practices for ERW today. So something that could help to shape both research and practitioners in terms of sort of raising the bar for quantification in the field. And I think luckily it's been adopted by some of the leading buyers and their ERW procurement standards. It's been adopted by the leading registries in terms of how they're updating their various standards and methodologies. And you're starting to see project developers really start to differentiate and distinguish themselves in terms of the research questions that they're able to answer on the back of these deployments. But like I mentioned before, Cascade has a broader scope across CDR, and particularly trying to identify different field level bottlenecks and structural challenges that no individual actor might be able to take on. So that, the sister pathways of enhanced rock weathering, ocean alkalinity enhancement, really a number of ways you can deploy alkalinity into an open system context. They interestingly have really different challenges, despite the fact that the underlying science and efficacy of these systems is likely similarly. So a big part of what we've been doing as we've been scoping out these other fields and the various folks working in those fields is just better understanding what the challenges are within those pathways. I think the simplest example of this, right, like I mentioned, is that enhanced rock weathering, you're doing this work on working agricultural land. You can work with a specific farmer or land manager to be able to help implement those projects. So while there are some longer term challenges that might come with how you get more farmers to adopt these practices, it's actually a fairly low barrier to entry to get projects going today. And obviously, I think you and your listeners know well, that's kind of a radically different situation than OAE projects and ocean projects more broadly right now, where there's this huge barrier to entry to getting projects in the water. Politically and bureaucratically, there can be social license challenges. These projects can be incredibly expensive. And as a result of this and sort of the timelines of trying to get these projects in the water, you just have a lot less active projects and a lot less proof points of in-water work in OAE than you do in ERW and some other carbon removal fields. So I often say, like, these fields, have similar challenges that they face, but they tend to hit those challenges at different times and at different paces. So it really changes the way that those fields can develop and the things that they choose to prioritize near term. But I think especially in the oceans, like when we're still sort of learning what does and doesn't work, and to what I think Tanis will talk about a bit, like the ability to share the learnings in real time of what we are able to get out, especially when that barrier to entry is so high, is really, really critical, because regulators need to make sure that the project's doing what it's supposed to do and is being done safely. There is a social license challenge, especially when working in the public commons. So helping communities to build more confidence in these projects and the ability to proactively address potential fears. Other practitioners and project developers to be able to share learning so that we can avoid unnecessary mistakes and just advance the field faster. And I think especially for researchers, let's just figure out how we can better share that information to understand the scientific processes and efficacy of these pathways to figure out what we can bet on over time.
So, Tanis, can you provide us with a broad overview of the data query program that Cascade is spearheading currently?
So one of the key challenges facing the enhanced rock weathering field is a lack of field-level data on carbon quantification. Most insights have stemmed from just a handful of academic field trial sites, primarily located in the global north. At the same time, we're seeing a big increase in commercial ERW activity globally. For example, as of October 2024, we estimated that these commercial ERW activities covered 200 times more area than all academic trials combined. And this really presents an opportunity to leverage what we call deployment-led learning, or the ability to use this increase in commercial activity to rapidly accelerate the state of scientific understanding in the ERW field. But to do that, it requires commercial actors to share data, granular, detailed data that can help advance the state of the science. But project developers have put a huge amount of time, money, and effort into collecting this data, and many see this data as a source of competitive advantage. Much of this data also comes from farmers' fields, so farmer data rights also are critical to uphold. So this is the real kind of conundrum or challenge that the data quarry works to address, is to balance these commercial interests and farmer interest with the need to rapidly advance the state of science to allow the entire field of ERW to grow.
Yeah, and can you speak a bit more then about how to operationalize that vision, right? How do you square that circle, right, of protecting proprietary data, but at the same time ensuring a modicum of transparency and useful cross-pollination in terms of that data among key stakeholders?
Through lots of listening, really the data quarry was developed as a true community effort. We posed kind of this challenge to the community of unlocking commercial data, and then really did an extensive set of listening tours with academics, ERW project developers, and buyers to really understand how we could build a system together to address these challenges. And what we came to is kind of three principles which the data quarry is built upon. So first, it provides segmented access to commercial ERW data. So first, all health and safety data, which is core to building that public trust in ERW as a safe pathway, is made fully public. Other data is made available only to researchers through a proposal-based process that is improved by an independent data governance board. Second, all data can only be used for non-commercial purposes. So there's a non-commercial use license attached to that data, so it can advance science, but not be used, say, for a machine learning model that then could be sold back to the company that put all of that effort into collecting the data in the first place. And third, existing data norms, including following fair metadata principles and, crucially, protecting farmer data rights, are maintained. And we're super excited that 10 leading ERW project developers have committed to sharing specific data sets through this platform consistent with these norms. In addition, 2 leading buyers, Frontier and Milky Wire, have both embedded the data quarry data sharing requirements into their ERW contracts, which will require future purchases to share data along these norms.
I think that's great. I think it's going to be critical given the limited resources we have and the daunting challenges, right, of getting this science right, that there be collaboration, right, and fairly robust exchange of data. So I'm glad to see how this is structured. Now, if I didn't read this incorrectly, your site emphasizes that your purpose is not to utilize this data to assess sequestration, but would some of it be pertinent to the MRV process?
Yes, so great question. So our goal for the data quarry is to unlock scientific understanding of the enhanced rock weathering field as a whole. We are not stepping out to, police individual kind of editing events and things like that. There's a robust and important kind of process to do that through verifiers and registries. This is really to allow scientists to access that data to advance our understanding. Of course, we would hope that those kind of scientific understandings can then inform the MRV process. And so, potentially building out, models over time for enhanced rock weathering, or answering other kind of key uncertainties around the science of ERW. And so, yes, would inform monitoring, reporting, and verification over time, but is not kind of part of that kind of validation process.
I think that's a great point that I want to pick up on also as we hand it back over to Jackie. I find it, to what Will said, incredibly inspiring and important to think about how we can leverage these early stage deployments and unlock science and learn from these activities. in the introduction, we briefly alluded to the fact that data standards is maybe not the most exciting topic of all times, but I think both of you, Brad and Tanis, you laid out how incredibly powerful it can be, right? To think about standardizing data or the variable by which a certain parameter is reported or is shared with folks. So Jackie, I'm curious, given what you heard, why you think folks should be excited about the OAE data protocol at this point in time, given that, to Brad's point, we have a little less activity in the actual water in the oceans, but we also have different sort of conditions to operate within, right? And it's open for public review. So given what you heard, why would you say that folks should engage on the protocol, and what should they sort of think about going into the future, how this protocol may be used?
Yeah, totally. It's, at face value, talking about the standardization of data maybe isn't the most exciting topic, especially when you have so many episodes that are exploring like these really cool emerging technologies. But the really cool thing about this moment is that we're setting one of the most fundamental and, in my very biased opinion, important foundations for the sector. So we have combinations of words that didn't mean anything before, and we have new words to define completely. And thinking about the future of this emerging sector, what we decide now will have lasting implications for how efficient we can be moving forward. And this will also be a foundation for decades to come, should MCDR be proven to be safe and effective and really take off.
Great. Yeah, I agree. It's been an exciting process to think about what data do you even need to share, right? And what parameter is even interesting, and even just thinking through the fundamentals of that unlocks so many open opportunities and challenges, etc. So in this review and open comment period right now, what are you looking forward to, and who in particular, should look at it and should expect to use it?
Yeah, anyone engaged in MCDR research, really. So as I mentioned, this is broadly applicable. If you have a background with model data, sensor data, discrete data, that includes sediment processes, nutrients, biological sampling, carbonate measurements, any ocean-related measurements, then your input is very, very welcome. And we also have a separate working group to round out our section on social sciences, but especially anyone currently engaged in OAE field trials, and especially those who have or are planning to seek funding from Carbon to Sea or NOAA. It will be required to be compliant to this data standard protocol. So you'll probably want to include your thoughts before the open review cycle closes on March 7th, and the first version is kind of set in stone and published.
Do you think that either the procedural or substantive things that you're working on in terms of this protocol have relevance for MRV beyond just some of the MCDR approaches?
Yeah, well, we could break that acronym down a little bit, right? This protocol doesn't really get into the M of the MRV, so the measuring or monitoring. That would be more a protocol defining how and what you need to measure. But it is very relevant to the R and the V, the reporting and the verification. So one thing we're really excited about is how this can help make the verification process not only easier, but more transparent. So we currently don't have a standard document stating what additional information need to be included with the data. And that additional information, often referred to as metadata, is incredibly important to interpreting the data itself. So like, for example, you might have a company reporting pH data from a sensor. If you don't have the details like how these sensors were calibrated or what manufacturers were used, it can be really difficult to assess the quality of those values of that data provided if you're just giving the numbers. Or in the case of model output, which is an incredibly important and very nuanced data type for quantifying carbon dioxide removed, there's just so many choices that go into setting up a model beyond just ending up with the final data product. there's no standard template for what metadata to include, right? So this makes the verification process pretty dang painful at the moment. And this is a template that we're including in the first version of the protocol so that all the decisions going into setting up the model can be recorded and evaluated a lot easier by third-party experts.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable point, that thinking about the metadata at first, and then how the relevant sort of, adjacent information helps address a certain question, which brings me to zooming out again a little bit back to the joint topic of Cascade and the OAE data protocol at this point. I'm wondering, Brad or Tanis, really feel free to answer, both of you as well, how you think that, standardizing or agreeing on a set of rules for data sharing and for data reporting, how that leveraged learning already. I mean, you already alluded to the fact that was the goal, but I'm wondering if you have some tangible examples already, or if you know better what you're looking for in this data sharing process, that could help folks understand a little, what the benefit of it is.
Yeah. So tangible examples. I mean, I think we unfortunately don't have any data in the system yet. Rock takes time to dissolve, and so data takes time to collect. So we announced the system in October, but are hoping to release our first data sets in this spring or summer. So that'll be really exciting. So, very eager to point to, the use of this data, helped inform the development of this model and those types of examples. But I think it really has helped move the conversation forward in a lot of ways by really saying, like, really digging into the specifics of data transparency. I think so often people hand wave, yes, data transparency is important, but really getting into the nitty gritty of what variables are we going to share at what time, by what deadline, was really helpful in unlocking these conversations in a really important way. So, and I think similar to kind of what Jackie alluded to with the pH sensors and things like that, really getting into the specifics of what metadata will you provide? How do we make sure that that's actually actionable? And that was a really helpful process to have, different groups understand, hey, this data actually won't be usable if you don't provide this metadata. And so we won't be able to unlock science. We won't be able to, kind of achieve that ultimate goal that we're all working to achieve, reduce uncertainty in the enhanced rock weathering field, without kind of, high quality data, high quality metadata. So again, I think it's really getting into the specifics, to Jackie's point, is really what's required. And just building on some of what Jackie said, a little bit different space the ERW spaces is versus the OAE. We don't, have a lot of data, so it's really kind of trying to unlock. And there's still currently a lot of different approaches that enhanced rock weathering is taking for quantification. So we haven't yet kind of gone through the really rigorous full standardization of, variable names, exact kind of approaches that that Jackie and the team has done with OAE, but that could very much be a future iteration. And so what we're trying to do in this early days is get data to come in, look at that data, learn collectively as a field, and then move to standardization as we get more and more data. But see that process is super important, and really excited to learn from Carbon to Sea's process and all of the kind of insights on how you bring the community together for all of these as the kind of next wave of iteration for the data core.
Yeah. Just to put a fine point on that, I think it is a practical reality, like Tanis said, that these are commercial-led companies right now, and they that are collecting the majority of this data. Many of them have real IP considerations that are tied to their fundraising and their ability to do these projects. So there can be at many times a gut reaction to saying we want your data, right? And I think the ability to go into the detail and say, okay, here are the different levels of subvariables. Where is the IP risk actually being held? I think we found out, I think it was really exciting and encouraging for me to see how much room there was and willingness for people to share in ERW and ag. And I would say as a general statement, it's a little more difficult to get people to share data in the ag context than it is in the ocean context. I think that's one of the things that the ocean field and Marine CDR has going for it. I think, operating in a public commons, there's I think a general willingness and understanding about the need to share a lot of that information, particularly environmental health and safety data. So we are starting in many cases, I think, from a higher bar in the ocean context than we might in a number of other fields. But the ability to sort of really parse out what is and is not critical for IP considerations and why you would hold on to something by getting into that level of specificity about the variables was a really valuable exercise for us, and I think for the project developers that we were working with on this.
Yeah, I think it's starting from a higher bar, and it's also, to your point from earlier, Brad, just sort of starting from a different starting line generally, right? Like it's sort of we're attacking a similar problem from different ends, which makes sense given the phase that ERW is in and the phase that OAE or MCDR broadly is in. And interestingly, I think in the ocean space, I'm curious about what Jackie thinks from like a research and scientific perspective. I feel like in the ocean sense, it wouldn't be possible in another way, right? Like to your point, Brad, we're operating in a public commons. Therefore, this data accessibility and transparency was, I think, a topic from the very first moment in time when marine CDR projects were sort of conceptualized. This question of where is the data and how can I see the data was always a concern, I believe. I wonder if that was similar in ERW or not. But certainly, Jackie, I wonder how you think about sort of from a scientific perspective, the value of seeing the data early on in oceans.
Just on an earlier point, I haven't spoken with Tanis in a couple of months, but it's been nice. They've been one of the first people that we talked throughout this data standards work, because they started the data quarry initiative months and months before we initialized our project. And like you mentioned, Anna, we're kind of tackling our standardization projects from opposite ends, right? So Cascade's working on getting the data there, and we're working on how the data should get there or what needs to go with the data to get there. And then the where is kind of what we're figuring out right now. But it was also really interesting, Tanis, that I didn't realize how commercial heavy the spaces that you're dealing with, and that is considerably different than, the kind of the community that we have formed around this, which are largely academics. So open source is just, their automatic kind of go-to. And that is a big learning lesson that we'll end up taking from Cascade is we will have to move towards more of the commercial, the IP constraints, all of those issues. And those are big hurdles that you've now gone through that we can leverage, which is nice. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think just building on some of the differences between these systems, right? As Brad mentioned, we're operating in an agricultural system, and so farmer data rights is really core and obviously very different than in the oceans context. So we really thought about kind of core to the data quarry system is really how would a farmer think about this, and how are they protected in this process? And so what we did there is we built on kind of the decades work of the agricultural industry to be thoughtful in protecting farmer data. And they've built collectively kind of an industry standard called the Ag Data Transparency Initiative, which is basically saying anyone who's using a farmer's data needs to be protecting that farmer data rights. So that includes making sure farmers are opting in so they know that their data is being used. And then we've committed to data anonymization. And so to prevent direct attribution to a specific landholding, because this data can actually be quite sensitive, not just to the, commercial ERW company, but actually to the farmer themselves. And maintaining trust with the farming community is absolutely paramount for this. And so really making sure sensitive or perceived sensitive data from a farmer's perspective is also protected is really core to the data quarry system, because farmers are an absolutely core part of the ERW ecosystem.
I was going to go back to kind of the research perspective point of view, because Tanis just reminded me also, it's interesting because when we're talking about our sensor measurements, there is kind of this more innate research forward space in MCDR or OAE right now, because there's this huge effort in calibrating data. So there's a lot of science that goes into trusting that data that is different than the data that comes out of ERW. So this does kind of make a lot of different push and pulls in the OAE space compared to ERW, and who needs to see it so that it can be qualified as good, quote unquote, good data versus just what comes straight out of a sensor.
Right. And then we have the added complexity that we need to put that data into models, right? And in the ocean space, the models are the more the final input sort of or tool for quantification. So that, I think, adds a layer of complication. On that note, though, Brad, I'd love for you to maybe synthesize a little bit of how you do see the learnings from Cascade shaping the OAE field, since you had a foot in the MCDR space before. Now you're in ERW. You're obviously quite familiar with our work, and I'm curious what you think some of the opportunities for lessons learned are, and where you do see key differentiations.
Yeah, it's something I think a lot about, and I think Cascade thinks a lot about. And I think that maybe one of the simplest ways to put it is that these communities tend to not talk to each other very much. I think we're getting better at it, but when you have systems like ocean alkalinity enhancement versus river liming versus enhanced rock weathering that are sharing these same sort of fundamental underlying approaches to removing carbon, it's kind of been shocking to see how much buffers there can be between those fields. And even when you're doing something like quantifying enhanced rock weathering to the best of your ability, you have to understand the river losses and the ocean losses and the things that happen downstream. So there's just a huge amount of, at the sort of academic and researcher level, learnings and resources we can share across that. Certainly between academia and practitioners, I think there's a big aspect to that. I think, specifically to the data component I mentioned, I think there is a higher willingness to share data within the ocean alkalinity fields or marine CDR fields in general, which is great. I think making sure there's a place to put that data, that's something that hopefully the data quarry will be able to do going forward in ERW. But, especially when you have researchers or early companies trying to do these first of their kind projects who don't necessarily have a rule book for what they're doing, they're trying their best to work their way through it for the first time. They're collecting data for the first time. They're reporting this information and safety information to permitting agencies and regulatory bodies for the first time. The end goal of that might be papers that might not be published for 2 or 3 years, which, and the ability to shorten the cycle between the work being done and the information being collected can go a really long way to shortening the cycles of maturity that can happen within these fields too. So one example is when we were at Running Tide and collecting some of our first scientific information, we had some really exceptional data sets that we were trying to figure out how to publish. And we had talked to NOAA and a few other folks who said, we've got these open data repositories, but then people have to sort of go find them themselves, So there wasn't necessarily a place where applied learnings could be shared in the context without getting to the full peer-reviewed paper component of it. So I think something like what the data access system within ERW is doing, I think what Carbon Plan is built with CDRXIV and the ability to get more learnings out more quickly. I saw Hourglass just published some amazing, I think, preprints on the CDRXIV website. That ability to get knowledge is really exciting. But I think, stepping back a step outside of data, right? I think we need to remember that, especially in the ocean context, these first of their kind projects, whether for research purposes or commercial purposes, are kind of going to be a mess, right? These project developers and these researchers are trying these things for the first time. They're operating in the ocean, which is the hardest environment in the world to operate in for a reason. I think in many cases, you're sort of lucky if you get to the point that you can do the science and collect the data, because 100 other things have to go right before you get there. So the thing I would really try to emphasize is contingency plans for data collection and redundancies before you begin operations, so that you can ensure that you can maximize these value of what is very expensive work to try to do in a real world environment. I think the worst case scenario is we spend a lot of time and energy and resources on something that you don't maximize the value of because you didn't have backup operation plans and data collection plans in place, or you started operations before before the folks who were looking at the data were able to tell you the best way for them to collect it. So I think having some of these standardized approaches, like what Carbon2Sea is developing, is really, really critical there. And I'm super excited that we're, making it easier for those learnings to be shared from the start.
Great. Yeah. I think it's also a matter of like practicing the muscle of aligning on something and whether that's a data standard or a foundations doc or whatever the process may be that enables that learning or that leads somewhere. I think even just Jackie can speak to this much more than I can. The process of like collecting everybody and sort of organizing everyone and getting the input and synthesizing the learnings. And obviously you guys did that for the foundations document. Like that in itself is already an incredibly valuable muscle to have built for everything that comes in the future, I think. So on that note, Jackie, on the note of building a muscle, maybe what do you think some of the learnings are so far from the OAE Data Initiative project that you've led?
Ooh, yeah. Well, actually, I'm not sure if this is a learning so much as a reflection, but I want to say it somewhere. I've been really taken back by the community involved in this work. So starting off, we knew that the success of this is really dependent on getting people on board to help. And without a financial incentive to be able to provide, I wasn't sure how this would develop. But the researchers and the companies in the MCDR space are some of the most hardworking and dedicated people and have really jumped in and driven this development. So we're also really excited about the second phase where we're going to start working more hands in hands with some of these field projects to implement these data standards and hopefully make them easier to use for the researchers. And then I also want to give a huge shout out to Lixing Zhang. So one really great learning out of this, kind of obvious, don't rebuild the wheel. So for example, NOAA has done a lot of amazing work on standardization of ocean acidification field project data, which has a ton of similarities to OAE. You're collecting a lot of the same data types, right? So from the start, we had Lixing Zhang at NOAA, who helped develop those ocean acidification community-driven standards, working with us on the project. And that partnership was absolutely crucial.
Okay, so invariably, I have a couple of policy questions for you. And the first one I'll direct to Tanis and or Brad. So have you received any feedback from the policy space to date in terms of the foundations doc and the data query concepts? And kind of a follow-up to that, have you encountered any regulatory hurdles or issues with private regulatory realms such as registries in that context?
I can take it, Tanis. Yeah, I think it's a great question, Will. Obviously, Foundations was the culmination of about a year and a half of work from our team, but really the whole enhanced rock weathering community to get a pretty deep and comprehensive resource out there. And I would say that one that if you don't have a geochemistry PhD is going to be pretty difficult to fully parse out. So part of that was we tried to make it very digestible for policymakers. We created some executive summaries, various tools like R&D priority lists that can be actioned upon by folks providing granting and aspects like that. So the creation of sort of auxiliary resources there, I think was a big priority for us, because the creation of those tools and resources that matter and speaking in a language that policymakers can understand is really critical for especially these alkalinity-based fields, which can be so complicated. I am not a scientist myself, and I often struggle with getting too in the weeds on the science here, but you don't necessarily need the policymakers to engage in the wonkiest of details, right? You need consistent messages over a dedicated amount of time that they are receiving that really helps to move the field forward. And I would say, like, we really should not underestimate the value of the creation of some of these foundational resources, even if they take time to advance. I was talking to some of the leading researchers at NOAA and Woods Hole and a few of the other leading oceanographic institutes recently, and we were sort of discussing, like, how were you able to work on MCDR, which until 4 or 5 years ago was kind of a third rail issue in the climate mitigation conversation. And it was really interesting. They were talking about the value of the National Academy study that came out in the early 2020s, even just the mention of MCDR in the IPCC context. It's something that I really undervalued as a project developer, because we were like, okay, there's something here. Let's go learn this in the world. But creating the permission structures as a field and organizationally for researchers and other people who can really contribute to be able to work on this, that can snowball really effectively into resources developed at the field level. And then the last thing I'll say specific to foundations is for both policymakers and the state of the field right now, there's value in the train and value in the output, right? The train being getting the whole community pointed in the same direction, even and especially when there are disagreements about things like how data needs to be collected, the bar that needs to be set, especially for early practitioners. There is a huge value in getting the field focused on a specific output. And then the output itself being something that buyers and registries and regulators can use is really, really critical. But really don't underestimate the former, because the former being getting the train moving in the right direction, because CDR can tend to be kind of a circular firing squad at times in terms of trying to get all our details right. And very often that those conversations never even make it to the decision makers and the policy makers, right? I thought exercise here is like, if you're a policymaker who was talking to the MCDR field once a quarter over the past 3 to 4 years, how different would the messaging be each time we talk to them, right? It is something that mature industries have gotten really, really good at, is coming in with the same list of 1 or 2 or 3 things the field really needs, even if that's just research funding in various forms, and asking for that consistently. So it really, sort of digs itself into the brains of decision makers. When we come with so much wonkiness and complexity, it makes it really difficult for them to figure out where to engage and how to move the needle. And I think that's true across CDR pathways, but particularly within MCDR. Yeah, Tanis, I don't know if any, specific reflections on the data query aspect of that, though.
No, I think you covered it well.
Yeah, I think that translational aspect is a really important one. So I'm glad you added that.
All right. So wrapping up the episode, how do you think this data query as well as the OAE data protocol has the potential to have a rippling effect on CDR policies generally, and maybe even governments and buyers' appetite to work with other CDR approaches in similar ways?
Yeah, so in terms of kind of interfacing with other CDR types, not just MCDR, and then the appetite from buyers, with the data standards development, if we do a good enough job, it won't actually be something that's maybe directly noticed. So it's thinking about the absence of these systems that you can really see how the future of these sectors might be negatively affected, right? So, for example, if some information on sensor data weren't documented for a project, so that might be like the sensor ID or coefficients that were used to calibrate it. And years later, we find that there's a better way to calibrate these data from that sensor type, or there's a problem with a certain sensor type from a specific manufacturer. These things happen. We wouldn't be able to go back and make these necessary adjustments to the data. And that can and should create hesitation on the buyer side and dilute trust in our ability to quantify the carbon removed, right? So the more transparent and standardized we can set things up from the start, the more trust will develop in MCDR. And we've seen how mistrust in one CDR method really leaches in to affect the entire sector. So these standardization protocols are incredibly important for all of CDR, not just MCDR, so that kind of we can all get lifted together.
Great point. Yeah. I wonder, Tanis, maybe if you or Brad have anything to add to that.
I would add just the really role that buyers can play in, I think, the MCDR and ERW space in catalyzing and kind of encouraging this data transparency. So I briefly touched on Frontier and Milky Wire as key participants in the data query, but I would make a call to all CDR buyers in really recognizing your leverage and opportunity to influence. And, of course, think about, the commercial aspects, protecting kind of commercial interests, but also so many of these fields are so early and we need more data sooner, and you can help be an important voice in order to kind of encourage that. So just a call to any of the buyers out there that might be kind of exploring these fields and the role they can play, and also encouraging the very sexy topic of data openness.
Fantastic last points, Jackie and Tanis. Thank you so much for sort of painting the broader vision and relevance of your individual work. Thanks to all three of you for joining and for making this topic of data so interesting and valuable, and hopefully inspiring for our listeners. And speaking of, thank you to our listeners for joining us again. You can look forward to another spring season of episodes. As always, please share our episodes widely. And for those who are interested in working with OAE data in the future or MCDR data, another kind reminder and shout out to please submit your feedback by March 7th. And with that, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much. See y'all.
Thanks.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Anna.